World War II films were civics lessons in action. They showed the military as an ethnic melting pot where men of diverse ethnic backgrounds were melded together to form an effective fighting unit. But of course, one immigrant group did not receive this treatment. Hollywood would justify the internment of Japanese Americans in films like Little Tokyo, USA, 1942, which portrayed Los Angeles as a hotbed of disloyal Japanese immigrants. Not until 1951 did Japanese American war heroes receive feature film recognition for their military contributions, winning more Distinguished Service Awards than any other ethnic group. The early post-war era saw a proliferation of social problem films that emphasized the problems of poverty, prejudice, and discrimination that immigrants faced as they entered a new society. Give Us This Day examined the struggles of an Italian immigrant bricklayer to flee the crushing tenements of New York's Little Italy. He dies in an on-the-job cave-in caused by his employer's negligence. Slavic immigrants find justice impossible to achieve in the American legal system in Call Northside 777. Japanese immigrants become the victims of wartime hatred in Bad Day at Black Rock and Japanese War Bride. Many of the most famous films of the 1960s deal with immigrant groups. There's West Side Story, 1961, that shows a Puerto Rican Maria and a Polish-American Tony breaching the color line by falling in love. Flower Drum Song highlights the conflicting traditions and intra-ethnic tensions between Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants. A View from the Bridge deals with undocumented immigrants from Italy and their conflicts with Italian Americans. One of the most influential films of the 1960s, the first to deal even indirectly with the Holocaust, was The Pawnbroker, 1965. It focuses on a Jewish immigrant survivor of the Holocaust and his experiences running a pawn shop in Harlem. This movie is a grim, haunting drama of a man who, as a result of brutality, has been left emotionally numb. He has lost his capacity to feel compassion. He's lost the capacity to feel human connection. He sees the people on New York's crowded subways as lost souls headed for their own concentration camps. Then he sees his black assistant shot dead during a holdup, courageously trying to protect him. The late 1960s and 1970s witnessed a host of popular films that explored Italian and Jewish ethnic groups, immigrant groups, sometimes nostalgically, like in the film Hester Street, sometime more critically, like The Godfather. Films about Jews such as Bye Bye Braverman, Goodbye Columbus, and Annie Hall dealt with the tension between the American dream of the melting pot and the challenge of maintaining distinctive cultural and religious traditions. In the case of Italian Americans, films tended to identify immigrants with organized crime. Yet these films also explored Italian American religious beliefs, class divisions, gender roles, and the existence of an extra-legal, intra-group judicial system. Today, the United States is going through the greatest wave of immigration since the early 20th century. And so it's not surprising that popular films continue to focus on immigration. A few films have focused on the plight of undocumented immigrants, of ethnic competition among ethnic groups, of problems of cultural and linguistic adjustment and the generation gap separating immigrants and their children. The theme of smuggling undocumented workers provided the basic plot for The Border with Jack Nicholson in 1982. Economic competition with the native-born Americans provides the source of conflict in the best film ever made about Kima, Alamo Bay, 1985, which examined the boat people from Vietnam and their conflict with native-born Anglos. For the first time in Hollywood's history, Hollywood viewed the effort to preserve a distinctive ethnic identity in positive terms, or at least in bittersweet terms. Moscow on the Hudson, one of the greatest films ever made on the immigrant experience, deals with the poignancy of leaving one's culture, one's traditions, one's friends, one's family behind. Next, we're going to shift gears and we're going to get back to history, and we're going to talk about 1939, Hollywood's greatest year. So, I'll explain in a few minutes why 1939 was Hollywood's greatest year. But before we do that, let's take a look at what might have been Hollywood's second greatest year. 1925 was pretty good. It featured Ben-Hur, first go-round, with its epic chariot race. There was Charlie Chaplin's greatest film, The Gold Rush, where he plays the little tramp exploring for gold in the Klondike. There was The Phantom of the Opera, and there was the World War I classic, The Big Parade. Why is 1925 overlooked as film's greatest year? Why do you think? Silent. People don't even see those movies now. Why should they care? There were no Academy Awards, and so there's no reason to think back what was the greatest picture of that year. Let's take a look at 1940. Its highlights include The Grapes of Wrath, His Girl Friday, the best and funniest movie ever made about reporters, Rebecca, the film that brought Alfred Hitchcock to Hollywood. There was Fantasia and Pinocchio, two of the greatest Walt Disney pictures, The Philadelphia Story, and The Great Dictator. So why isn't 1940 considered one of the greatest years in Hollywood history with all this to its credit? Some thoughts?
Because it lives in the shadow of 1939?
Absolutely. How about 1941? Another good year. Citizen Kane, which we'll talk about in a bit. The Maltese Falcon, Meet John Doe, and Dumbo. 1942 saw Casablanca and Bambi, along with Pride of the Yankees. 1950 was a good year. There was Sunset Boulevard, All About Eve, and Cinderella. 1962 was especially great. It featured Lawrence of Arabia, which may be the all-time greatest screen epic. There was To Kill a Mockingbird, an extraordinarily evocative look at growing up in the South. There were Betty Davis and Joan Crawford battling each other tooth and claw in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. There was the taut thriller Manchurian Candidate, still one of Hollywood's greatest movies. There was The Music Man. There was The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Other films of note in that year include Days of Wine and Roses, The Miracle Worker, Long Day's Journey into Night, Birdman of Alcatraz. So why don't we remember that year? No one would ever, I think, say that offhand as Hollywood's greatest year, though in terms of films it really looks pretty good. Why not? Why don't people think of the great old days like 1962? 1963. And the reason, I think, is this, that Hollywood went through a generational change, and that's the old Hollywood. It's not part of the new Hollywood. 1967 was one of the greatest movie years, a year I remember vividly living through. And you thought that the movies were just going to be greater and greater and greater, that was just the beginning. You didn't know that that was one of the peaks. It's the year of The Graduate, the year of Bonnie and Clyde, In the Heat of the Night, In Cold Blood. 1973 was another great year. American Graffiti, The Exorcist, Mean Streets, The Sting, Serpico. 1976 was pretty good too. All the President's Men with Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman chasing after Richard Nixon. There was The Front, tribute to the artists whose lives were ruined by Hollywood's blacklist. There was Taxi Driver. There was John Wayne's tear-jerking Goodbye, The Shootist. That year also saw Rocky, Carrie, Clint Eastwood's The Outlawed Josie Wells. But why, again, don't we think of that as a peak of Hollywood, even though it looks pretty good when you recite the names of the movies? A lot better, say, than 1999, or 1998, or 1997, or 1996. Okay. Well, let's take a look at 1939. Between the end of the Great Depression and the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States enjoyed a film year that truly was the greatest in Hollywood's history. It was 1939. It was a bad year for peace. World War II began when Germany invaded Poland, but it was a great year to go to the movies. Americans fell in love with a scarecrow, a Tin Man, a Cowardly Lion, and Toto 2. They rumbled across Arizona with John Wayne. They traveled to Washington with Mr. Smith. And they watched Atlanta go up in flames. Now, Gone with the Wind would, of course, blow away the competition at the box office. It would win 10 Academy Awards, including Best Actress, Best Supporting Actress, and Best Picture. So let's take a look at 1939's losers. They include Hollywood's greatest tearjerkers, its greatest gangster pictures, its greatest love stories, its greatest adventure stories. John Ford directed 3 movies in 1939, 3 classics: Stagecoach, Young Mr. Lincoln, Drums Along the Mohawk. Victor Fleming only directed 2 pictures in 1939. Directed The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. Not bad year. Laurence Olivier became a star in 1939, but he wasn't alone. 1939 brought us John Wayne, brought us Bob Hope, brought us Judy Garland, brought us Henry Fonda, brought us Jimmy Stewart, brought us Greer Garson, and brought us Ingrid Bergman. Pretty good year for creating movie stars. One suspects it will look a lot better compared to some of the recent years. Babes in Arms featured Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. Confessions of a Nazi Spy was the greatest spy film ever made. Dark Victory had Bette Davis go blind. Destry Rides Again with Marlene Dietrich. Drums Along the Mohawk shows a farmer and his wife battling Indians in revolutionary New York. There's Goodbye, Mr. Chips, a portrait of a veteran teacher looking back at his career. Gunga Din is the greatest Hollywood adventure film ever made. There's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. There's W.C. Fields' funniest film, You Can't Cheat an Honest Man. But that's not all. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, in which Jimmy Stewart battles corruption. There's Stagecoach. There's Ninotchka, where Greta Garbo falls in love with a capitalist playboy. There's Only Angels Have Wings. The Wizard of Oz was originally supposed to have Shirley Temple star, not Judy Garland, but 20th Century Fox would not release her from her contract. There was The Women, which we've talked about earlier in our class. There was Wuthering Heights, the story of a legendary love affair with Laurence Olivier as the brooding Heathcliff and Meryl Oberon as the object of his affections. We have Henry Fonda starring as our 16th president, young Mr. Lincoln. So what made 1939 such a good year to go to the movies? Why do you think there were so many memorable movies, movies that we still see even today, and even if you haven't seen them, you've heard of them? How come? What is it?
Because by about that time, directors and actors and stuff were getting it figured out. You know, the talking motion picture had been around long enough that they were, a generation had actually, you know, were perfecting their...
So good? We've had even more time. No, what you're saying makes perfect sense to me, but it should imply that movies should get better, and we don't get the sense that they're getting better, at least not better than 1939. So what else could be the explanation? I think you're onto something, but I want you to go another step further. What do you think? Why 1939? Why not 1935? Why not 1945? Why then?
It was a historical shift in American history, going from the Great Depression to the World War and prosperity, or something.
I think
like
the end of the Depression is very important. There is renewed optimism. There is more money in Hollywood to plunge into production values, as they put it. But what else? What else would make 1939 different than other times? Different than today? Okay. Well, we're going to talk about them. We've just mentioned one. America was ending a decade of depression. Studios, once beleaguered by the country's moribund economy, were making money again. The country felt optimistic culturally and politically, an optimism that, of course, would soon fade. By 1939, Hollywood could afford to fund blockbusters. The second reason is a sudden influx of directors from Europe, chased off by Hitler. Hollywood would gain such notables as Fritz Lang, Ernst Lubitsch, and Billy Wilder. So it suddenly had the world's talent to draw upon to make great movies. But the biggest reason is the simplest of all, and that is the studio system was truly at its peak. There were 8 major studios in 1939. There were the 5 majors: MGM, Warner Brothers, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, and RKO, and 3 minors: Universal, Columbia, and United Artists. The majors own theaters as well as studios, so they can exhibit movies in their own theaters. They formed the country's 11th largest industry in 1939. They had 590 actors under contract, 114 directors, and 340 screenwriters. And all of those people worked just like you work, 8-hour days every day. They worked even a half day on Saturday, and they took home a weekly paycheck just like you do. And what difference would that make? Why are they working 5.5 days a week? And what's going on here? This doesn't sound like Hollywood today, where you get the feeling that Julia Roberts doesn't work a 5.5 day work week. What's going on? What's the nature of the studio system? What's its essence?
It keeps all those people attached together. They're all working together every day.
Right. It makes movies the same way Detroit makes automobiles. Everybody has a job, and everybody works, and they work all the time, and they always have to produce, and these are very talented people. If you can work them all the time with real regularity, you can get wonderful production out of them. It took an average of 22 days to shoot a movie at an average cost of $300,000. Hollywood was grossing about $700 million a year, so they could guarantee bankers a return of 4.5% on every dollar invested. That's not a huge amount, but not bad. Not bad. And so it was easy to let Hollywood take chances because you knew that by the end of the year you were going to get your return from Hollywood. You're going to get a 4.5% return on your investment. Not bad, especially during the late stages of the Great Depression. And so Hollywood would crank out 365 feature films a year, about double the number today, and none of those movies were remakes. None of those movies were sequels, and none of those movies were taken from old TV shows. In other words, every movie that came out was an original and greater than the originals we produce now. Imagine when you have screenwriters working 5.5 days a week for you with names like William Faulkner or F. Scott Fitzgerald. You have America's greatest writers sitting there working on plots for movies. Today's movies focus, of course, on teens and special effects instead of plot and character development. But the studio system did not focus on special effects. It focused entirely on plot, dialogue, and character development. In The Wizard of Oz, the Kansas tornado is simply a whirling sock spun against a miniature set. Done as simply as could be, and it works just as well as anything George Lucas can create. In Gone with the Wind, special effects meant that pieces of old movie sets were ignited to simulate Atlanta burning, and 80 dummies were used to appear as wounded soldiers. Now, in 1939 ended. Within months, the lucrative European market had been cut off, and Congress passed a law prohibiting what was called block booking, in which theaters had to take not just one movie, but a whole group of films. And this allowed the major studios to fill their theaters, and it made sure that they would get a guaranteed return on all their movies. And when America entered World War II in December 1941, the golden age was over. So let's now look at the greatest movie that Hollywood ever made. If we could have the overhead projector for a moment. Who is this? Orson Welles, the boy genius. He's 24 years old when this picture is taken. He is the greatest movie maker this country had ever seen. And he creates a movie that the writer John O'Hara would call in Newsweek the best picture I ever saw. Pauline Kael, America's greatest movie critic, would call Citizen Kane the one indisputably great American film of the sound period and more fun than any other great movie. It truly is the one great movie that you will get pleasure watching. Citizen Kane is an incredibly unique picture because it's the one film ever made inside a Hollywood studio with complete freedom. In 1938, RKO was struggling to avert bankruptcy. It needed a miracle to save the company. And then they thought they figured out who would bring that miracle. Orson Welles. Orson Welles had just caused a national uproar. He had made a radio broadcast, The War of the Worlds, in which millions of panic-stricken Americans were convinced that the Martians had invaded New Jersey. If he could bring that off, certainly he could bring off a great motion picture and save RKO Studio. But Welles wasn't enthusiastic about making motion pictures. He loved the theater. So he rejected RKO's offers. And as he rejected them, the offers kept getting a little better, and a little better, until finally they offered him complete control over the movie he would make. Now, Welles knew nothing about making movies. He was completely inexperienced. But he was a genius, and he had freedom, and anyone in Hollywood who had talent wanted to work with him. They had thought up ideas their whole life and had never had a chance to try them out. And suddenly there's this guy with total freedom. So anyone who had talent wanted to work on Citizen Kane. So a miracle would take place, but it wasn't the kind of miracle that RKO Studio needed. It was a miracle of a very different sorts. And so we're going to talk about Citizen Kane, which is truly a great movie, but it doesn't meet any school teacher's definition of greatness. It is not a work of special depth. It is not a work of great subtlety. It is first and foremost great entertainment. Entertainment in a popular style. This is not French New Wave cinema. It is a movie that achieves its effects out of muckraking satire. But it's a movie that never had a chance to be a popular success because it was a movie that was a satire grounded in the life of this man. This man, whose picture means nothing to us these days, was the most powerful man of his time. His name was William Randolph Hearst, and the Houston Chronicle today is a Hearst newspaper, but it doesn't mean anything like it did. Because in 1939, William Randolph Hearst was still a man at the peak of his power and influence. He owned the nation's largest, most influential chain of newspapers and magazines. Hearst had put together the most astonishing media empire this country had ever seen. And then he had built himself a palace larger than any of the palaces in Europe, Sam Simeon, and he furnished it by rummaging the riches of all of Europe. So if you take Ted Turner and you add in Rupert Murdoch and you add in Bill Gates, then you have William Randolph Hearst. And if you could imagine attacking Ted Turner, Rupert Murdoch, and Bill Gates in one movie, then you can imagine what Citizen Kane was like. The film produced a controversy as great as the controversy that swirled around the War of the Worlds But this time, Orson Welles could not get away with it. And he, whole life, would be in the shadow of the controversy that erupted over Citizen Kane. Now, William Randolph Hearst didn't do anything to stop the film. He didn't have to. Because when you are powerful, when you are influential, there are always people around who will be happy to do whatever they think you want to have done. You don't have to ask them. It's their pleasure to destroy your enemies. And so others would do the dirty work for William Randolph Hearst. For example, Louis B. Mayer, head of production at MGM, would offer RKO $842,000 if they would destroy the negative and all the prints. Now, this is remarkable. Louis B. Mayer does not go around handing out huge sums of money. In particular, he doesn't hand out larger sums of money than the movie cost to make, since the movie only cost $686,000. But astonishingly, RKO declined the offer. It refused, even though RKO had no theaters of its own to show the movie in, and therefore it would have to ask other companies to exhibit the film. Now, the movie was scheduled to open at the Radio City Music Hall because the Radio City Music Hall in New York was owned by the Rockefeller family and the Chase Manhattan Bank, which owned the music hall and owned the studio. Okay? And then suddenly the music hall said the movie would not appear there. Why might they turn this movie down? Well, a Hearst gossip columnist warned the Rockefeller family that there would begin to be attacks on John D. Rockefeller in all the Hearst newspapers if the film was shown. And so it seemed easier not to show the movie. Hearst newspapers blamed bad publicity on RKO Pictures and simply wouldn't review them. 3 days after the press previews of Kane, the Hearst newspapers, in conjunction with the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, launched an investigation of Hollywood for employing foreigners when Americans needed jobs. Now, those foreigners were all refugees from Hitler, but that didn't matter because this was all going to be in revenge for Citizen Kane. They also launched an attack on supposed subversives in Hollywood, like the writers William Saroyan, the writer Sherwood Anderson, or Stephen Vincent Benet. John O'Hara wrote this review in Newsweek. "It is with exceeding regret that your faithful bystander reports that he has just seen a picture he thinks must be the best picture he ever saw. With no less regret, he reports he has just seen the best actor in the history of acting. Reason for regret, you, my dear, may never see the picture." I assure you, you'll never see reviews like this again. Citizen Kane did not lose money. But in Hollywood, you have to make big money to be a success. And Citizen Kane didn't do that. And so its failure never balanced the scandal. And so it sort of just faded into oblivion. It was finally recovered in the 1960s when people began to see it on college campuses again. And sometimes late at night you'll see it. But basically it just slipped away, even though it's the greatest movie Hollywood ever produced, when Hollywood was at the peak of its power. Here is opening night. You can see the theater where it was first presented. If you look above, you'll see a news strip reporting of war in Libya. Here was an ad for the film, And you can see it's not a very good ad. It's not a kind of ad that would get you to go see this picture. It does suggest something about the film. That is, that the film offers a variety of perspectives on Kane. But this sure isn't an ad that would make you go see it. Here's another ad for the film. Some called him a hero, others called him a heel. Again, it's not sort of the ad that would drive people to see something truly inventive. And yet that's exactly what Citizen Kane was. The most inventive picture in American film history. Here is one of the opening scenes. You can see it's called Xanadu in the movie, but it's Sam Simeon, the home of William Randolph Hearst. And notice, I mean, that's not a real picture. They were able, this is all special effects. They could do this all very cheaply and get very, very effective effects. But also notice the great use of black and white and the use of shadows that had been used in German film, but it hadn't been used in Hollywood films. And then it opens with a newsreel, News on the March, it's called. And News on the March then presents a brief summary of the life of Charles Foster Kane. Here you can see Kane in the middle. For 40 years, appeared in Kane newsprint, no public issue on which Kane papers took no stand. No public man whom Kane himself did not support or denounce, often support, then denounce. I mean, it's great. It looks exactly like Hitler. Later, you have Kane's childhood. This is Agnes Moorehead. You can see her again. Notice it doesn't look exactly like a classic Hollywood film. Technique is much more important here. Camera angles are much more important in this film. The building where he started his first newspaper in New York. Its humble beginnings, a dying daily. And here you see Welles and his henchmen at the New York Daily Inquirer, circulation 26,000, soon to be several million. One of the most astonishing features of the film is the way they're able to get Kane to age. Take a look at him there, then look later when we see him as he grows older. Here, Welles and his friends are beginning the newspaper. And in his first issue, he issues My Declaration of Principles on the front page. And one of the questions the film is asking, of course, is whether he'll be able to maintain those principles or whether they'll fly away, gone with the wind. His marriage has one of the most, in a scene about Kane's marriage, they have one of the most famous images in all of film where Kane and his wife are first lovebirds, and then you show them reading the newspaper, sign that they have drifted apart. This is the most famous image from the film, is Kane runs for governor of New York in front of this incredible blow-up. You can see the blow-up again. And why does he lose? Fraud at polls, his newspaper announces. But the real reason, scandal. Candidate Kane caught in love nest with, quote, unquote, singer. The highly moral Mr. Kane and his tame songbird. See the pictures. Then Kane marries singer. The first use in American film of montage. I mean, it's a seemingly simple film that's using very sophisticated film techniques to make its points. His new wife, singer, preparing for the opera. Then a close-up of her singing. Then Charles Foster Kane writing the review of her singing, a negative review that had been started by one of his friends, and he finishes it. And later, his wife in Xanadu putting together crossword puzzles. And here we see the now elderly Charles Foster Kane in one of the most famous scenes. I'm sorry, I have a very poor picture of it. There's an endless number of mirrors and images of Kane as he's walking. And finally, the last scene of the film, a close-up of the word rosebud, the secret to the mystery. And here was Orson Welles himself as an old man. This is in his 60s, when he was generally known as the world's greatest has-been. At the film's end, a character says, "I don't think any word can explain a man's life as a group of researchers search through the warehouse of treasures left behind by Charles Foster Kane." Then we get a famous series of shots leading to the close-up of the word rosebud on a sled that has been tossed into a furnace, its paint curling in the flames. We remember that this was Kane's childhood sled, taken from him as he was torn from his family and sent back east to a boarding school. Rosebud is then obviously the emblem of the security, hope, and innocence of childhood, which a man can spend his entire life seeking to regain. And so the last scene ties this film together. It seems to solve the mystery, even while the characters are saying that no one word can sum up a man's life. Maybe Rosebud was something he couldn't get or something he lost, says the reporter assigned to the puzzle of Kane's dying word. Anyway, it wouldn't have explained anything. But of course, the joke is that it explains everything. All he really wanted out of life was love, says one character. That's Charlie's story, how he lost it. And Rosebud is a remarkably satisfactory answer to why all that was. Citizen Kane is filled with all kinds of playful paradoxes. It's just a pleasure to watch because it's really a movie made for adults. It's a movie that's fun, yet there's also some depth to it. Its surface is as much fun as any movie ever made, but its depths surpass almost any movie ever made. It is one of the miracles of filmmaking that in 1941, a first-time director, a cynical, hard-drinking writer, an innovative cinematographer, and a group of New York stage and radio actors were given the keys to a studio, given total independence, and came up with a masterpiece. Citizen Kane is more than a great movie. It's a gathering of all the lessons of the emerging age of sound, just as Birth of a Nation had assembled everything that had been learned in the silent era. Now let's talk a bit about the making of Hollywood's greatest picture. Orson Welles has been quoted as saying, "Theater is a collective experience. Cinema is the work of one person." Apart from being incredibly arrogant, this statement is completely inaccurate. More than any other cultural production, film is a collective product. No one person makes a film. It is always truly a team effort. Welles himself played Kane from age 25 until his deathbed, using makeup and body language to trace the progress of a man increasingly captive inside his needs. His assistant, you all remember from The Paper Chase, was John Houseman, himself one of the country's greatest actors ever. The film features some of the screen's greatest performances by some of the greatest actors ever. Joseph Cotton, Agnes Moorehead. The movie's cinematographer, Greg Toland, pioneered a new method of photography, one that we use all the time now. It's called deep focus. In deep focus, everything in the picture, no matter how close or how far away, seems to be in perfect focus. So that the composition and movement determine where the eye looks first, not the focus of the camera. And this was something completely new used in Citizen Kane. But much of the credit for Kane goes not to Toland, not to Houseman, not to Moorehead, not to Cotton, and not to Orson Welles. It goes to a now forgotten Hollywood screenwriter named Herman J. Mankiewicz. Herman J. Mankiewicz. If you have a bit of a memory, you'll remember that there was a Mankiewicz who worked for JFK and LBJ in the early 1960s for John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, and he was his son. Mankiewicz was a friend of William Randolph Hearst. He was a frequent house guest of William Randolph Hearst. And Mankiewicz is the ultimate proof that your friends are the ones who can really hurt you. It's not your enemies, it's your friends. Mankiewicz would betray anyone for a good story, but he probably made a mistake when he betrayed William Randolph Hearst, as you'll soon see. He couldn't get away from it. His career would be destroyed because of Citizen Kane, and he would go to an early grave because of Citizen Kane. But Mankiewicz was perhaps the greatest of all the Hollywood screenwriters of the 1930s. Today, if you're a great writer, you don't work in Hollywood. You probably work in a creative writing program like one at the University of Houston. Before the 1930s, if you were a great writer, you supported yourself working for a newspaper. But during the 1930s, if you were a great writer, you went to Hollywood. And you did your great work on the side while you spent your day job doing screenplays. Okay. If you think of the great American writers of the 1930s, they were all in Hollywood. George S. Kaufman, Nathaniel West, S.J. Perlman, Preston Sturgis, Dorothy Parker, John O'Hara, William Faulkner, Ring Lardner, all of America's greatest writers were there. Mankiewicz once sent this telegram to another writer: "Will you accept $300 a week to work for Paramount Pictures? All expenses paid." The $300 is peanuts. Millions are to be grabbed out here, and your only competition is idiots. Don't let this get around. Needless to say, it got around. Mankiewicz was born in New York City. He graduated from Columbia University. He served in the Army Air Force in World War I. He later worked as a foreign correspondent in Berlin. He was a publicity agent for the dancer Isadora Duncan. He wrote for Vanity Fair, Saturday Evening Post, the New York Times and the New Yorker makes him sound like a pretty respectable guy. But that's not what he was at all. He was a drinker. He was deeply cynical. He aged early. He was a gambler. He was accident prone. He was always in debt. He would get an F in citizenship, and no one would admire him. But he was the greatest writer Hollywood ever had. In 1925, he had been drama critic for the New York Times, and he went to cover the performance of an actress named Gladys Insull. Gladys Insull's husband was the wealthiest man in America. His name was Samuel Insull, and he owned all the major electrical utilities in the United States. He even built his wife an opera house in Chicago, which you can still go to even today. It's a wonderful building. Now, Gladys Insull was an actress mainly because her husband was a rich man. She was 56 years old when she took up a career on the stage. And of course, she chose roles perfectly appropriate for her age. She played an 18-year-old. Mankiewicz saw her perform, and he came back to his desk, and he took out a bottle of whiskey, and he drank it, and he began to type, and he fell asleep over his typewriter. And here's part of his review, the only part that we can reprint. As Lady Teazle, Mrs. Insull is as pretty as she is diminutive, with a clear smile and dainty gestures. There is a charming grace in her bearing that makes for excellent deportment, but Lady Teazle seems much too innocent to lend credit to her part in the play. He was fired for that review. But in Hollywood, he made a fortune. His base pay was $40,800 his first year. Now, I think to put that in some kind of perspective, that you have to multiply that figure somewhere between 10 and 50 times to get its purchasing power. I mean, it's worth at least a $500,000 salary today. Then it went up to $56,000 his next year. His movies had an incredible carefree, wisecracking spirit. His style was crude, it was tough, iconoclastic, and flippant. And he wrote some of the greatest movies Hollywood ever had. $1 Million Legs with W.C. Fields, Monkey Business, Horse Feathers, and Duck Soup for the Marx Brothers. He wrote a screenplay for a Western that begins with Rin Tin Tin, frightened by a mouse, and ends with a dog taking a baby into a house on fire. That's the sort of guy he was. Irreverent is the word that goes with Mankiewicz. And Hearst was the perfect topic for him. Many of Hollywood's screenwriters had worked for Hearst newspapers. They knew this man. They knew what kind of guy he was. Hearst's New York Mirror's advertising slogan was 10% news, 90% entertainment. I mean, these were newspapers of a different breed. But the people who worked for Hearst realized that Hearst represented power in America, but a new type of power. Not political power, not the kind of economic power that you see with a John D. Rockefeller, but a wholly different kind of power that was new to America, the power to shape people's minds, the power to shape thinking. Hearst got his first newspaper in 1887 when he was 24. His dad was rich, and he simply asked his dad for a newspaper. He said, "I think running a newspaper would be fun." Over the next 3 decades, he added to his empire until he had 30 newspapers and 15 magazines. He was the most powerful journalist, the most powerful publisher in the world. He brought the first comic strips to America in 1892. He introduced the sports page, the stock market columns, and the like. He brought a new kind of journalism to America, which was almost a branch of show business. Mankiewicz and Orson Welles wanted to do something startling, something that would cap the invasion of the Martians. After all, the Martians had only fooled the boobs in America, but they wanted now to get at smart people too. Said Mankiewicz of Welles, "There but for the grace of God goes God." And Welles knew that he needed to do something big if it was going to work with Welles. So he proposed that they make a movie about a person's life from several points of view. And first he suggested John Dillinger, the famous gangster. And then he suggested Amy Semple McPherson, but he knew what he wanted to do all along. Then he suggested William Randolph Hearst. And Hearst was perfect. Hearst and Welles were both big men, so physically Welles was ideal for the role. Now, Kane is a movie about money and love, but it isn't just another movie about a rich man who isn't loved. It's the scandalously unauthorized, muckraking biography of a man who was still alive and still powerful. Imagine if, at the peak of his presidency, Hollywood had made a movie about Bill Clinton showing sexual escapades and the like. I mean, you have to attack somebody not when they're down, but at the peak of their power. And that's what Citizen Kane does. Imagine making a movie about Teddy Kennedy immediately after Chappaquiddick, about Chappaquiddick. That's sort of what Kane is like. Now, the structure of Citizen Kane is not like an ordinary movie. It is a circle. It opens with a newsreel obituary that briefs us on the life and times of Charles Foster Kane. The footage, with its portentous narration, resembles the March of Time newsreels, then being produced by a new media mogul by the name of Henry Luce, founder of Time and Life. The newsreel provides a map of Kane's trajectory. It keeps us oriented as the screenplay skips around in time, piecing together the memories of those who knew him. Curious about Kane's dying word, rosebud, the newsreel editor assigns Thompson, a reporter, to find out what it meant. And we never see Thompson's face. Why don't we see Thompson's face? Why not show us his face? What's the message that the movie's sending? That there's a new kind of journalism appearing, a kind of corporate journalism in which the journalists are simply faceless. I'll talk more about this, but what Kane is really about is the history of mass media in the United States. It's very interesting. And the new media, symbolized by Henry Luce, Time, Life, and the March of Time, is bureaucratic journalism, the exact opposite of what William Randolph Hearst did. So Thompson is a faceless corporate flack. He questions Kane's alcoholic mistress. He questions his ailing old friend. He questions his rich associate and other witnesses while the movie loops through time. And yet, it doesn't seem like you're reading a modernist novel. You don't get the sense that this is Thomas Pynchon or something that you can't understand. It's easy to understand what's going on in this film. By flashing back through the eyes of many witnesses, Welles and Mankiewicz create an emotional chronology set free from time. Now, as biography, the movie makes no pretenses towards total accuracy. It reworks and it condenses many incidents, and it takes many incidents from the lives of other rich people and then attributes them to Hearst. Unlike the fictional Kane, who was born to a Colorado boarding house keeper The real-life Hearst was born in San Francisco, the son of a mining magnate and a U.S. senator. The actual Hearst, like the fictional Kane, was defeated in a bid to become New York governor. But the real Hearst was not defeated by the voters. He was defeated by corrupt politicians in New York State. Hearst had printed a cartoon of a Democratic political boss in prison stripes, and Murphy then arranged to have Hearst's ballots stolen, and he rigged the recount. Hearst, however, was later elected to the House of Representatives. Of course, there are real similarities between Kane and Hearst. Hearst was one of the creators of a sensationalistic journalism known as yellow journalism. He introduced the comic strip, banner headlines, and editorial crusades, anything to make a buck. His newspapers were largely responsible for the United States waging war against Spain in 1898. 2 years earlier, he had telegraphed a photographer in Cuba saying, "You supply the pictures, and I will supply the war." When the Spanish government had taken a daughter of a revolutionary leader captive, he sent in his own commando team to go rescue her and bring her out, and then held a ticker tape parade for her in New York City. When he needed reporters to cover Spanish atrocities, he found reporters like Winston Churchill, who will later become Prime Minister of England. He will get Remington, the great artist, to go to Cuba to make drawings of the war. I mean, it's just remarkable what he is willing to do. Like Kane, Hearst had a huge estate. He didn't have one castle, he had 4 of them on his estate, known as Sam Simeon. It covered 50 miles of the Pacific Ocean and comprised 240,000 acres. So it's even bigger than Xanadu in the movie. But what made the movie particularly scandalous is that it publicly exposed scandals that the general public had not known about, that had not been general knowledge, but that Mankiewicz knew because Hearst was his friend. By 1937, Hearst had owned 20 newspapers and a host of magazines, including Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, Harper's Bazaar, and House Beautiful. And of all the scandals involving Hearst, the most notable involved his affair with an actress named Marion Davies. Marion Davies was one of the great comedians of the 1930s. And the story of how she got into Citizen Kane is one of the classic tales of duplicity, of how your friends can really hurt you. Mankiewicz liked Marion Davies, but he couldn't resist destroying her on the screen. She was spunky, she was funny, she was beautiful, she was like Carole Lombard. She was just an actress that people fell in love with. But Hearst didn't think comedy was good enough for her. So Hearst would have dramas made for her. He would have his newspapers over-publicize her. They overpraised her constantly. A typical Davies film would open with the theater's ventilating system pouring the scent of roses into the theater. Her movies were reviewed with 8-column banner headlines. People realized something weird was going on, but the details had not really been made public. Mankiewicz portrays her in the movie as an empty-headed dope, a pathetic whiner, and a drunk. I mean, there's nothing that could be meaner than to portray her this way. She did have a drinking problem, but it had, she mainly had it under control. But after this, she is ruined. The film incorporates incidents from the lives of other early 20th century tycoons, like Samuel Insull, who had built that opera house for his wife in Chicago. But the film is not just scandal, it's also style. It uses a modernist structure and techniques that was completely new to American film. It doesn't tell the story of Kane through a unified narrative, but through contrasting points of view. That he's a spoiled brat, that he's a miserable, lonely man, that he's an incipient fascist. Different interpretations of who this man really is. There is the Kane who made shadow figures with his finger. There's the Kane who hated the Traction Trust. The Kane who chose his mistress over his marriage and political career. The Kane who entertained millions. The Kane who died alone. With its oblique camera angles, its looming close-ups, its deep shadows, it looks like a German expressionist film. And every post-war film will bear the imprint of Citizen Kane, not to mention most Simpsons episodes which plunder the film ceaselessly for backdrops. But the movie is much more than a sophisticated biopic. One theme of the film is how the American system made it possible for a rich boy to inherit the power to control public opinion as if it was his own private plaything. So it's a sort of political movie in a way most other Hollywood movies are not. The title of the movie is, of course, quite ironic. Hearst, the offspring of an economic baron, is a citizen just like Louis XIV was a citizen. Well, maybe technically he's a citizen, but he's not really a citizen. Hearst had attacked the President of the United States in his newspapers. He called him, quote, the most despised and hated creature in the hemisphere. Then he ran an editorial about McKinley entitled, Killing Must Be Done. And then a week later, someone goes and assassinates William McKinley. That's the power of the press, I guess. And that altered Hearst's career because he didn't want to be blamed as the man who was responsible for the assassination of an American president. So he became a sort of super patriot. Just like the city of Dallas after the Kennedy assassination repositioned itself. Instead of being the capital of the far right in the United States, it presented itself quite differently. Well, that's exactly what Hearst did. He renamed his newspapers The American. He presented himself as a number one American, committed to patriotic values. And he found ways to use patriotism to get things he wanted. Another theme in Citizen Kane is the way Kane's idealism is undermined. In the film, Kane buys up the staff of a competing newspaper, something that Hearst did in real life. He decimated the staff of the New York World. But one theme that the film makes clear is that the reporters then change Kane. That you can get them, but you can't make them do what you want. They get you to do what they want. One of Hearst's favorite tactics was to hire away men he didn't really want by offering them twice or triple the salary they were currently making. Then, as soon as they came to work for him, he'd fire them, and they were left without a job. He viewed this as fun. Mankiewicz wanted to get his revenge. But the major theme that the film explores is the evolution of the instruments of mass communication in America. It's not just one man's personal story, it's really the history of a period. Citizen Kane covers the rise of the penny press. It looks at the Hearst-supported Spanish-American War. It looks at the birth of radio, the power of political machines, the rise of fascism, and the growth of celebrity journalism. All in a movie that's fun to watch. A newsreel subtitle reads, 1895 to 1941. All of these years he covered, many of these he was. Hearst supplants the staid, upper-class patrician journalism with his sensationalistic exposés of crime, of sex, of disasters, his attacks on the rich, his phony lawsuits against big corporations that he calls predators. Of course, he's the richest man in the country, and here he is attacking the rich as predators. Paradoxical. He has screaming patriotism, faked photographs, exploitation of superstition, and it attracts millions of readers. He also offers the public puzzles and comics and contests and music and medical quackery. In short, his youthful dedication to the cause of the people gradually fades away. It degenerates into something quite different, a kind of cheap chauvinism. And as he grew older, he became known as a notorious anti-union, pro-Nazi red-baiter. And so what Citizen Kane is trying to do is to reconcile, to understand those various facets of his character. But by the 1940s, it was obvious, even before television, that the age of William Randolph Hearst was just about at an end. That a new kind of journalism would take its place, a journalism that was truly mass and multimedia, that wouldn't just control newspapers, but would control new kinds of technology, like newsreels, but clearly that's just the forerunner of television. And so it's not an accident that the life of Kane is framed by the figure of Henry Luce, the new media tycoon who will control American public opinion. And so, what happened? It's the greatest American movie, and what happened to the men who made it? Well, Mankiewicz would make one last movie, Pride of the Yankees, and he would win an Academy Award, and then everything would fall to pieces. He was driving in Hollywood, and he hit a parked car outside the house of Marion Davies. It was a minor accident, but Mankiewicz resisted arrest, and Hearst had Mankiewicz right where he wanted him. For months, the Hearst newspapers campaigned against the dissolute Mankiewicz, who was apparently portrayed as just the tip of the iceberg of the dissolute lives that people lived in Hollywood. The Hearst newspapers went at him so deeply that eventually Mankiewicz turned to the American Civil Liberties Union for help, to sue Hearst to just stop this endless persecution. But his career was now ruined. As for Welles, I think it was even worse, if that's at all possible. Welles had been known as the boy wonder and the boy genius, and he truly was the boy wonder and the boy genius, but this would forever be thrown at his face for the rest of his life. Because once you make Citizen Kane, no matter what you make, it can never be as good again. And the New York Times would refer to him quite openly as an international joke, as the youngest living has-been. And most of us, I guess, remember him for doing wine commercials for cheap wine. And it seemed like that the mighty had fallen lower than it's possible to fall. No one was ever able to do what was expected of Welles, and that is he was expected to make one movie masterpiece after another. But Citizen Kane was the product of very unique circumstances, circumstances that could not be duplicated again. It came at the very tail end of Hollywood's golden age, and it wasn't possible to reconstruct that period. So while it comes out in 1941, it's really the last gasp of that studio system that we talked about that reached its peak in 1939. And so when we move on to next week, we're going to be talking about a very different kind of film. We're going to talk about war films, and we're going to see that these mark a real break in Hollywood, because these movies are ideological in a way that the films of Hollywood's golden age had not been. And Hollywood will adopt a very different role in American society. That's enough for today.